All right, Chairmen, we're in session. And today we have a topic again that has baffled man since the beginning of time, and that is, what is the order with which I place my pedals for an optimal signal path? And I would say that of any one question that I'm asked continually, it probably has something to do with this particular question. What do you say?
I say stop overthinking it. Do what I do. Throw your pedals up in the air. However they land, that's how you hook them.
Yahtzee, yeah.
Yeah. That's my method. It's worked for me so far. Lots of warranty repairs, but I always know what way to run my pedals on that day.
Oh my
Brian?
gosh. I just let my kids decide. I'm just like, just pick them out. Just whatever you think is great. Half the time it's like reverb first.
3 metal zones.
Right.
Exactly.
Yep.
Well, we've been watching a lot of Marie Kondo and the Home Edit on Netflix, and they believe in like color coordinating your libraries. So I just color coordinate, and so if it's happens to just be a certain color, it gets to go in that particular order.
It's a good
I like
idea.
it.
But alternatively, if you want it to sound good, there is sort of like a recommended signal path, and of course there's variations to this, and I think that one disclaimer that we can make is, irrespective of what is said today, there is no right answer. There's nothing that can override a personal preference, and I think that that's sort of the bottom line. So take what we say, and we may not all agree. We may have some areas where we do disagree. But I think take what we say as sort of a framework with which you can start to experiment if you're considering experimenting with your signal path, and then ultimately let your ears be the guide. I think I've heard us all say a version of that in the past. I don't want to speak for you, but I feel like I've heard this said. So I think with that in mind, maybe let's start with what we would envision as sort of being the very first thing in the signal path chain. What do you guys usually think is like these sorts of devices come first? Grant, what do you think?
I would, depending on what pedal list you have, I would probably start with a fuzz, depending on which fuzz the person has. And again, even that, it's oftentimes, even yesterday I was talking to someone about their pedalboard, and they had a fuzz like 7th or 8th in their chain. A bunch of overdrives and then fuzz at the end. And I asked them, have you tried this fuzz right at the beginning? Because a lot of fuzz pedals, as a lot of you guys know, listening, like to see the guitar. And he said right away, yes, I have tried it at the beginning. I like it after the overdrive. So I was like, great. At least your ears have now spoken, and we know that that's the place you like it. So I would probably start with fuzz at the beginning, and at least just try it there, and then move on.
Yeah.
And Ryan?
I'm gonna agree with that. Anytime I have someone that asks where to put a location, I typically say fuzz first. That's just generally what I mentioned, but I again also say, have you experimented with where you like it? Certain pedals react in different ways, so it's all about like personal choice. Because I have some people that are like, oh yeah, I like my fuzz very first, or I like my wah then my fuzz, and I'm like, oh, like I'll ask them why, because I'm just generally curious, and they're like, oh, because I've tested it and it reacts better in that order. I'm like, great, let's do that.
Yeah, I would say fuzz, but I would go with sort of a broader category and just say anything that is impedance sensitive. And I think the easiest way that I could, and this word impedance is used a lot, a high impedance, low impedance. I usually think of the easiest way to just sort of layman's terms about what we mean when we say impedance is really just how sensitive something is likely to be in a given environment. If it's high impedance, it means it's extremely sensitive to everything in this environment of the pedal board. And so we have to be really considerate about where it goes. And if it's low impedance, it means it's not going to be very sensitive. And this is why when we go to buffers, when we get to talk about this in the signal path, buffers provide a low output impedance signal, which helps make the pedal board impervious to a lot of the changes that occur between pedals. And that's part of the reason why they're so valuable when they're done properly, is that they kind of make the rig immune to a lot of the external factors that ordinarily would plague high impedance pedals. Now, there are cases where you want those high impedance pedals to see your guitar pickups directly, which also consequently are very high impedance. And we like that interaction between a passive guitar pickup and a fuzz pedal or a treble booster, or in some cases even wah pedals will have some characteristics of high impedance and impedance sensitive devices. So if you have any of those, a vintage style wah, and I don't mean that the wah is actually built in 1960, but maybe that it resembles something that was made in 1960 or 1970. So it could be a full tone Clyde is an example of a new wah, but the spirit and the design is pretty much a transplant of what was, out in the 1960s. All those types of devices are ordinarily going to be fairly impedance sensitive, which means they want to see guitar as close as possible. Now, I think one thing for us to explore maybe within this, when we're talking about, fuzz faces, tone benders, those are kind of the typical types of fuzzes that we're seeing, super fuzzes, and treble boosters and wahs. There's even some debate around the order that those might go in. What do you guys kind of see as, this particular conversation order? Because sometimes people don't like their wahs first because they don't like the way that they interact with the fuzz, and when they turn on the wah and the fuzz, it affects the sweep of the wah. There's some workarounds, of course, to that, but what do you guys think about kind of, speaking of just the impedance sensitive type stuff, where do you guys kind of find is a good sort of baseline for maybe people to get established?
I would probably, if they have, let's say, multiple pedals that in air quotes should be first, but you have two of them, so you have to pick one.
Yeah.
I would probably first go down the trail of like, which one are you using the most? Mm-hmm. And maybe that one, if a sacrifice needs to be made, if we're just keeping it really simple, you have to pick one. Which one are you using the most? And
I thought you were saying like
first.
Sacrifice a chicken in the parking lot.
That is one way to correct impedance issues. One drop of thine firstborn chicken, on the second fuzz shalt not do the trick. So yeah, I would probably say, which one are you using the most? And then put that one first. If you want like some workarounds, even one that has come up recently, and you guys might have some other thoughts on this, but the new Benson Germanium Boost, the Benson Boost, that little green one, that one can correct some impedance issues with these exact pedals that we're talking about. It could allow you to put a fuzz that is a bit more sensitive later in your chain if that boost is right before it. Depending on how in-depth you want to go and how much you really want to keep that second pedal on your board, you could do some workarounds. You could put in a true bypass strip and only turn on the loop that you want to be first in your chain. But yeah, I'd really just go down, which one are you using the most? And then from there, do those experiments. Switch the order around. Have you really tested every combination, and have you come up with this one is the one that really needs to see the guitar, and kind of move on from there?
Ryan, what do you think?
Yeah, it all comes down to like, and I'll give my personal opinion and be like, okay, well, in the past experience of working with these types of pedals, this is what I would recommend. I always give a recommendation, but typically, and I don't work with a lot of like wah pedals on builds. I just don't. When I do, it's like Andy or someone, and even him. I've even asked him when he was just here, and I even asked him. I was like, "Oh, so why do you go there?" He goes, "Man, because this type of wah needs to see my guitar first. Like just the wah reacts differently." His fuzz is, somewhere else in the chain, and he's like, that's, it's just a lot of like trial and error of, yep, that sounds good, move it around, yep, that sounds good. And he's like, it's whatever is the most natural for, like, I'm not losing any, tone, the pickups are reacting the way I want to. And with someone like him, he's using similar guitar pickups, so there's not all these variations where you'll get some guys will use single coils or humbuckers, and they'll all kind of react differently. So I typically tell people, like, test it with whichever main guitar you're going to be using. Like, what is your main one, not your backup or your secondary. Like, what's your main one? Make sure that is, everything's driving. So that's typically what I suggest.
Another creative solution we've done in the past that just came to mind as well is just make a passive order switcher. And so you can actually flip the order in real time with a remote or with an onboard switch or whatever, and change which one is first that way. Again, it's more of an investment. It makes things more complex, which is not always going to be the right answer.
Sure.
But yeah, I'm sure you've got some tricks up your sleeve, Mason.
Well, I mean, as far as the order is concerned, I even though some people do prefer wah further down the chain, and even sometimes prefer wah like after overdrive, like there's some people that like it really late in the chain. Like one guy I think of that sounds really great with the wah that uses it much later in the chain is Michael Landau. And if you want to hear a really great interpretation of how he uses wah, listen to the Raging Honkies albums, and there's 2 of them, and there's a lot of use of wah, and it's all after overdrive. But I think generally for most people that kind of want the Stevie Ray, the Hendrix, some of the really kind of Mount Rushmore wah users of the impedance sensitive wahs, I generally think that they need to be first, and the sweep will be affected when a fuzz is on. However, the correction that people make to that is they will add a buffer to the output section of the wah. And some companies have that built in, like Full Tone has a buffer option built in, and the buffer is only on. I mean, and really it's not really a buffer. All it is like, I mean, I guess it's any pedal that's on, right, is a buffer, whether it's true bypass or not. But he's changing the output impedance so that it can work better to maintain the sweep of the wah. And so the switch is basically engaging sort of a more a fix for the impedance, the output impedance that's driving from the wah into the fuzz, or just leaving it stock. And that's basically what that switch is doing. It's not giving you a buffered signal when the pedal's off. And I think that will help the sweep issue, but now you've got a buffer hitting a fuzz, right? So it's a compromise either way. Either you lose some of the sweep of the wah by leaving a wah in stock format and putting it before a fuzz, or you're compromising the sound of the fuzz by driving a buffer into the input of a fuzz, which we know is usually a no-no. So I usually think, if we're thinking about the Mount Rushmore of wah users, those guys didn't have that option in order to run a buffered wah. They dealt with the abbreviated sweep of the wah. I would generally go something like wah, fuzz, treble booster, something like that. If I'm thinking about sort of like 3 major food groups of how to, kind of create the essential high impedance sensitive pedal signal path.
Have you guys ever messed around with, like in this instance, let's say there's 3 pedals that typically would like to see the guitar, with adding circuits that give you a high impedance output? So wah, mod it to have a high impedance output into fuzz, mod it to have a high impedance output into the treble booster, as an example. Like, have you ever messed around with those? I personally have not, but I know they exist. And I've always been curious, but haven't, taken the deep dive yet.
Yeah, there's 2 companies that I know have made versions of this at times. I don't think that they're available now currently, but one of them, who is also Canadian, is Access Electronics. Mario from Access had made what's called an unbuffer, and same with another guy who's not really, I don't think he's doing pedals anymore, but he did pedals for a while, and his name was Lyle, and he's from a company called Psionic Audio, and I think mostly he does amp repair stuff now. And they had versions of this, and I think it helped to a degree, to basically create what looks like the guitar pickups to, these pedals, and kind of used it almost like as as an input output and then send and return. So you would like loop the pedal into kind of this unbuffer box. But realistically, and there's some people that have attempted to build some version of this into the pedal so that they can be impervious to, let's say a wireless or something like that, like Benson.
Yeah.
And I think that they go a good bit of the way there, but realistically, you would need to have basically build in a single coil pickup, like the magnetic, like the windings of the pickup without the pull pieces to really try to create what a pickup does and how it interacts with these. So, I mean, they're all going to be some sort of compromise. I will say, though, if you do need to use a fuzz in a low impedance environment because you have a wireless or you have active pickups, the best one that I've found is the MXR Classic BC 108 fuzz, the miniature version. I used that on Paul Jackson Jr.'s rig, who's played on Thriller and Daft Punk and was all like was just the king of session guitar tones. This great guy, great player, and he used that pedal, and I was so impressed with how good it sounded with a wireless running into it. Because usually when you go wireless and fuzz, it's just like it sounds really spitty and just kind of like undefined. And this sounded really good. Also, the FZ series Boss stuff works really well with wireless. So just a heads up if you are somebody that's using wireless or have it in a rack or something like that and can't give it a direct guitar signal, those are good options.
Great.
We've spent a lot of time on low impedance or high impedance products that are impedance sensitive. Let's move on to the next part of the signal path. I would say that after that you probably want to hit your first buffer. What do you guys think?
Agreed. I think from there, I mean, again, I'm sure this will come up compression wise, where you end up putting compression, but a lot of guys that I work with want their compressor next.
Before a buffer.
Well, I mean, it depends what kind of pedal you're getting. If it already has a good built-in buffer in it, then I would get people to just not buy an external buffer. If they're running into something, another common pedal there might be their Boss TU3 tuner, then we'd be talking about buffers, and we'd be talking about an external, high headroom, low impedance buffer at that point. But I mean, depending on for the people listening, like you just alluded to, Mason, every pedal that is on is technically buffering your signal. How good of a job that's doing is a whole nother conversation.
Yeah.
But yeah, depending on the pedals they have, I'll advise them to, put a buffer in there. Or if it's a great pedal with a good buffer, then we can kind of forego it.
Yeah. What do you think, Brian?
Yeah, I'm on the same terms. Typically, if they are wanting, like, if their next pedal, doesn't, they don't trust enough that they want a buffer added, I'll typically, a lot of times I'll install the interfacer.
Thank you.
I do that a lot. I have one client. He's from Europe. His board's actually down here. I don't want to pull it off. It's like a 40 by 20 board. I don't want to pull it out.
It's a kitchen table.
It's awesome. it's amazing, and he has a lot of vintage stuff on it. But he is using the LA Sound, the blue, like their blue junction box. So we're running into a bunch of like the fuzz and stuff, and then it's going into that to hit the buffer, then it's hitting the rest of the pedals. I actually did two setups like that, one with the LA Sound and another one I just finished with the interfacer, and it's literally that. It was input into it, into the fuzz, I think it was into two pedals, one was the fuzz, into the buffer, then the rest of the pedals, and it really depends. A lot of guys half the time don't like really think about it, and they're like, oh yeah, no, I'm fine. And unless you see a point of adding a buffer, let's not do it. So I'm like, well, it kind of depends. So then we'll kind of talk over the options. And I mean, honestly, like when it comes to buffers and stuff, there's a lot of people that just like, I know there's plenty of videos and stuff out there about buffers and why, but I think there's a lot of those people that think it's just like, oh, it doesn't do anything for my signal. I'm like, no, it really does, because like I have a PBC-10 and I typically turn all the buffers off, and I started slowly turning them on to hear the differences. Like, oh my gosh,
Huge.
like that is insane. Like I didn't like even all like the like even just guitar into the unit alone, and I was like turning it on, turning it off. I'm like, oh my gosh. So yeah, it's a it's like a case by case kind of thing. So
Yeah. I would say that after the impedance sensitive stuff, I definitely would say go to buffer, your input buffer right after that. And, usually the criteria that I think about, whether it's, a buffer that we're making or a buffer that we're using from, somebody like Goodwood or whatever it is, that if it's not going to be sort of a high quality standalone buffer, and there's lots of other options too, Mesa Boogie makes a really good one that actually Mario from Axis Electronics designed. Their dual buffer system, the Highwire, is also really good. There's also good standalone ones, like actually one of the sleeper buffers. It's not an interface style, but it's like single buffers. Is the True Tone Pure buffer is actually very good and well designed and meets all kind of the spec requirements. But generally, you want to look for something that's a 1 meg input impedance at the very least, and as low output impedance as possible. So the closer to 0, the better.
yeah.
And there's some ways to fudge that, and it's not an imperfect recommendation, or it is an imperfect recommendation. But I would say that generally that'll kind of help you. Now, there are some pedals that have good built-in buffers already. I wouldn't say a lot of them do. I'd say fewer than probably 5% have that. But most of the stuff from Strymon is all 1 meg input impedance, 100 ohm output impedance. The TC Electronic Bonafide buffer that's inside of the TC Electronic tuners meets that criteria as well. The Boss pedals do not meet that criteria. So, it's one of those things where I think it is important to take your input buffer seriously, because that's the place where you're sort of starting your low impedance journey through the pedalboard. You want to make sure you're loading your guitar pickups so that they react the same way that they would if you plugged into an amplifier, which means that you really need to have a 1 meg input impedance, because that's what pretty much every amp out there is. So I would definitely say that's where we'd want to go buffered in some fashion, whether that's through a pedal, through a tuner, or a standalone buffer, whether that's through an interface or whatever it might be. What do you guys usually think of as the next thing after the buffer?
I mean, I think Grant and I kind of on the same page. Typically, it's like we get compression. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I get requests like, yeah, put the compressor right there. And I did it for a long time, but after experimenting and getting some input from some other people, I actually put it after my drives. So for me, I'm gonna say I would say boost, only because for me, if a boost is after the drives, it muddies up the overdrive. So personally, I suggest boost.
And this is, I think, where we might start differing. It probably goes into a lot of personal taste.
Yeah.
Compression is one of those ones that, firstly, depending on the compressor you have, if you have something like a great example, a Bondi 2026, Bondi Effects, it is such a transparent compressor to the point where I feel like I didn't have the studio or session experience to really know how to dive into it. He did such a good job just making it do what it says. Like, it compresses your signal, but I really gravitated towards ones that were a little bit easier for my less trained ears as far as compression goes to hear. And something like even a Cali 76 has a distinct sound, and much more so than the 2026, even though they're based on the same compressor. But I loved putting that earlier in my chain, really driving the compression, so it had, when I turned it on, I knew that the compressor was on. It had that sound to it, whereas other guys might want something a lot more subtle when compressor is turned on, or maybe they leave it on all the time, and maybe after the overdrives really works for them. But when I was going back and forth, A being examples of compressor, let's say before gain and after gain, I really didn't like it after the overdrives for the way that I had it set. I'll say that. Yeah. So I personally like it earlier in the chain, but I know that Other guys would absolutely disagree with me, and they would want it after the gain stage.
Yeah, for compressors, I kind of look at it like, are you trying to use it as more of an effect? Are you trying to use it as more of a limiter?
Yeah.
What's the thing that it's trying to do? I look at something like a Cali 76, and I think it's a great pedal and it's well designed, unquestionably. I think, however, if we're truly using it in the fashion that an 1176 was used, it would never, ever, ever be used before your distortion.
Totally.
Because if you used an 1176 in a studio, it would be coming after the microphone. So it would be after the amplifier completely. And so I think that this is a consideration in terms of the type of compression that you choose. Usually when I think of compressors that are early on in the chain, like this after the buffer, let's say, I usually think of pedal-based compressors that are based on compressors that were designed as pedals, Dynacomps, orange squeezers, things of that nature, where it's not at all attempting to be a studio-style compressor. It's really attempting to just replicate sort of, like an orange squeezer originally wasn't even a pedal. It was like a module that you plugged into your guitar jack, and then a cable would come out of it. So those are really more historically close to the guitar. You couldn't get any closer to the guitar than having a module with a 1/4-inch jack that stuck out of it, that just hit your guitar first. And so I kind of look at it that way, and that's not to say that a Cali 76 couldn't sound good up front. My reference points are always like the actual unit itself and where would it be used historically, and how do we recreate that sound most effectively. So I usually think of that as being something that would come after the microphone. So I don't usually. Some people will elect to put them up front because they like that sound. I don't usually hear that sound as what's advantageous for a guitar with the early on compressor. But the other thing that I also kind of lump into the compressor side is kind of any sort of dynamic pedal. So anything that affects the overall dynamics of the sound. That could be envelope filters, for example, where you're relying heavily on your pick attack to trigger the envelope. Those could be also octave pedals and things like that. I like to put those in a similar position, and I'm not talking about octave fuzzes. Those would kind of go in that high impedance and impedance sensitive area if you had an octave fuzz. I'm talking more like OC2,
Micropog.
Yeah, those type of things. I kind of put maybe in that range as well as any sort of filtering effects, whether that's a Qtron or a Mutron or an Ibanez AF9 or any of that sort of stuff. I usually think about those sorts of filtery sort of effects to be there as well, and as well as anything that affects the dynamics.
Yeah, I would, with all of this stuff, again, like the thing at least that I tell my customers is there is a place that is, maybe more correct, again, for those listening in quotes, that's more correct. But again, like go back to trusting your ear. So even with the compressor example, like, personally, I tried both. I found the one I liked. I know it's kind of breaking the rules, but I'm not going to put something later in my chain because it's the right thing to do on paper. I want it to be the right thing for my sound. And even with pogs, like a micro pog, not so much the fuzz ones, but even there in experimenting, putting an octave or certain filter effects after your overdrives completely changes the sound. And you may really like a pog after your overdrives, the actual octave effect comes through so much stronger after the overdrives. Whether or not that's, again, right is to be determined, but it's a different sound. And so I always tell people, try both, and you may end up exactly where you have it right now, but at least that there's a couple options out there and you've picked the one that works best for the sound you're going for. Yeah. And so I know there's a lot of stuff even that we'll still talk about today that will break the rules, but it's really cool to see, the guys that often break the rules after doing a bunch of experimenting, not breaking the rules just for the sake of breaking the rules, but, I've done the experiments. This is where I like it. They'll come up with their own unique sound and their own approach to playing, and some people will love it, other people will hate it, and they'll want it to be the other way. But I think that's kind of the really, for me at least, from my perspective, this is like the creative process of being a guitar player. Like this is, everyone's going to run we could have 10 guitar players with 10 effects on the exact same 10 pedals on their board. And there are going to be a ton of variations. Everyone's going to have their opinion on which one is the best, and they could all be right for what they're trying to go for. And I think that's kind of the fun with all this stuff. And so even for me, I like putting my Pog after my overdrives. I like putting my compressor typically before. And I know that's, they should be inverted, or, both should be closer to the front. But personally, that's where I really connect with. I really enjoy the results.
Yeah, I will say, I got to add to that. If I typically get like people that will get like the GFI synesthesia or an H9 or something, and or even a Mobius, Chairmen Mobius, or anything else that does pre-post, and they're like, I really want, because the GFI is a dual engine, it'll do 2 algorithms at the same time. They'll put some of their modulation stuff pre and then some of it post, because they're like, oh yeah, I like how it reacts differently. So that was another one I forgot to mention. If they don't have a pre-post pedal, but if they do, I typically, they're like, should I do it in stereo? I'm like, well, how are you using it? Oh, I like this effect from this area of the board. I'm like, okay, then we should utilize.
Can you explain for those that have never done this before, maybe don't know what pre-post is?
Yeah, so pre-post, if you think about, if you've ever seen a GFI synesthesia or even a Mobius does it. It's H9. Or an H9, thank you. Or the H9. Pre-post is where you can say, we'll do the H9 because it's a little more relevant to a lot of people. The H9 in a preset, you can pick the type of, like, first off, the device you can pick if it's stereo or if it's pre-post, or I think there's a couple other like input settings I can't quite remember. But like, say one algorithm, you have the pedal set for pre-post, so your input 1 and your output 1 is running in the front of your amp, or in the front area of your signal chain, and then input 2 and output 2 are after, like, say the and like by the wet effects, so maybe it's going in like the effects loop or something. You can, in a preset, tell that preset if you're in pre mode or post mode, so that effect will work in the front of your chain or in the effects loop. So there's some guys that like certain sounds, like the Leslie sound, they might like them pre, but then they might like that chorus, or they may use that H9 for a secondary delay or something. In the effects loop, you can, without having to unplug a bunch of stuff, you can utilize that pedal in 2 different areas without having, to do all this crazy. The wiring is actually really simple. It's basically you're acting as if it's 2 pedals. It's really simple. The GFI synesthesia, which is amazing, is a dual engine, so you can use 2 effects at the same time. So you could be hitting the front of your chain with an octave, but then you could be also using the second side of it at the exact same time in your effects loop to hit, another type of modulation effect, or maybe a chorus in the beginning of your chain and an octave in, after the, the volume or whatever it is you have it. So that's a big factor. I tell people, I'm like, and a lot of people don't know that they have the option, because they're like, oh, I've always ran it in stereo. I'm like, that's fine, you can do that. I'm not trying to overcomplicate. I just want you to have the options. I'd rather than be like, oh dang, I wish I would have known that, because I've had it happen. People go, I went home and I read the manual on this and it says I have all these options, and I'm like, well, yeah, we talked about it. Oh, well, I was scared to do it because I'd never done it. I'm like, yeah, I mean, that's one thing with reading the manuals. You start kind of figuring out all the little hidden features, and that's one hidden feature that people kind of forget, because the effects loop routing on like the GFI it's like a split cable and everything. It's just, I think it's a split cable. It's like some of the wiring can look daunting, but it's really actually quite simple.
So I guess practically that would just look like, you might go from your, buffer sensitive pedals or, fuzz at the beginning into input 1 on the H9 they have a compressor built in. Then you go to all your gain stages out of the H9, back into the H9 for input 2 for maybe a chorus, tremolo, and then out to delay, reverb, and so you can place it in a couple spots in your chain.
Mason, if you allow me to screen share, I actually made a diagram for this.
Okay, here we go. All right, if you're watching on YouTube, you can see Brian's screen share.
Which never disappoints, I have to say, as he's bringing it up. Whenever Brian says he wants to screen share.
Can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
so I literally just made this about 2 seconds before we started this, so I'll explain it. I don't know if you can even see my mouse cursor,
Yeah, we can see it. We can see it.
Great. Okay, so this is like I've had this happen all the time. Like you have like your fuzz. Basically, what you do is you would hit the first input of the GFI, which will go to the first engine. So we'll call it engine A, the first one. Engine is an algorithm, so it's the same thing. So then you would actually come out, and you could hit your overdrives if you want. Go through your overdrives, your boost, or whatever you want to do. Hit your volume pedal, and then it would go into the secondary inputs. Hit those pedals, and then from there on would hit the rest of your wet effects for stereo. But basically, this just allows you to basically have two pedals in one, rather than having, you know, two GFI synesthesias sitting right here and here. This one guy does both. Same as this one. This can do pre-post. It's the same type of the wiring. Not to be complicated. If you're watching, if you're listening, I designed a pedal board on pedalplayground.com, and just I have kind of a screenshot. I'll post it on my stories when this video goes live. I'll post one. But basically, just allows you to utilize the pedal, and a lot of people utilize the H9 in this factor. Josh Smith, I did his board, which he's actually on tour with Joe Bonamassa right now, and he has his H9 set up for this exact thing. His Leslie is, I think it's pre, I think he's using it pre, but then he has some delays and stuff that he's using post, and depending on the algorithm, it'll switch between. It won't do them at the same time because it's a single engine, not a dual engine. But this allows him to get more use out of the pedal without having to unplug a bunch of stuff. It's just like, he's like, oh yeah, if I'm feeling like adding this tone to it, I'll get on my phone and I'll just type it for pre or post, and it'll do it. It's a really handy tool. But yeah, that's where you can maximize like your gear and get, you know, multiple stuff out of it. So I am going to unshare, and thank you for that comment. I always try to make up diagrams for people to help them understand, because I'm a visual person. So
yeah.
that's I mean, in a long shot, that's what I tell people about pre-post stuff, is that you can utilize pre-post. Don't, if it starts to get overwhelming, it's not something you have to use, but like I've used it before and it came in handy. I don't use it right now, but like it depends on, you know, what you need personally.
Love it.
So just to recap where we are, we've started with guitar, we've gone to impedance sensitive devices, fuzz, wahs, treble boosters. Then we've gone into the input buffer, or let's say a tuner that has a high quality buffer like the TC Electronic with a bona fide buffer. Then we've gone into compressors. And then we've gone into some of the dynamic style pedals, talked about pre and post, some effects that could go before overdrive and distortion, some effects that could go after. But I think now we're going to get to the most arguably ever changing and ever complicated part when people are talking about signal path. Invariably, we're talking about the order of overdrives and distortion devices. Yes. And I think that's where the most confusion is caused, because this is where we're using, in many cases, multiple effects in combination. And so the order becomes ever more critical when we're combining things together. So I'm curious about where you all land in terms of how you go about deciding the sequencing of overdrive and distortion devices. So, Brian, let's start with you. What do you think?
Thank you.
Typically, I typically go low gain to high gain. The thing is it's a mixture of people that are like, oh yeah, I use 5 overdrives and I have 1 overdrive for every different type of stage. Okay. I had one guy who had 3 of the same pedal on his board, and a bunch of people gave him, it was 3 Walrus Ages. Someone gave, like, all these people gave him crap about it. Like, oh, why you use 3 pedals? He's like, I love the pedal so much that I just have 3 of them, and I have them all set to a higher gain. And I'm doing the same thing with two drives. But it's typically I'll be like, okay, you have 3 overdrives. Do you have a preference? Oh yes, I like this preference. Okay, well why? Oh well, I like how the higher gain when you run it into this, say high. Like I've had people go high to low gain, but I've asked why, and they're like, oh, I just like how it reacts, how the pedals, because the pedals change. You flip the overdrives around, they're gonna 100% react differently. So even like throwing a boost pre or post, that's the same thing. The pedal will react differently. So I typically tell people low to high gain to get a better response from them, so you're not capping that highest gain. You're not starting with the high gain and then hitting it with a low gain, and you're like capping it. But yeah, so typically it's low to high gain for me.
I would say that's a great starting point for a lot of people. Some people you chat to have really strong opinions of how they want their drives set and ordered, but a lot of people are just like, I honestly just plugged them in as I bought them, and this is where I ended up. And so it is a really difficult question, and I personally shy away from saying just do this, because everyone's going to hear something different when they hear a guitar tone. And so what I tell people, this is a very, very general rule of thumb. That's my asterisk before I go into this next comment. But I like to tell people the last pedal, especially in the gain stage, the last pedal that is on. So let's say you have overdrive, distortion, boost, and boost is last. If you turn on your overdrive and distortion, your sound is going to sound the most like the distortion. It's not going to sound like the distortion just by itself. It will be a combination, but it will take on the most characteristics of that distortion. You put on the boost at the end, it's going to take on most of the characteristics of that boost. And so it's just, think of when you're going to be stacking your pedals, what combinations you're going to be using, which one do you want it to sound the most like when stacked? And it'll typically be the last one. So even going back to my octave example, running octave after your overdrives, the octave comes out in the mix a whole lot more when it's last in the chain, because it's the last one on in that combination of pedals. So that, again, I know that some people are just shaking their heads like, Grant, you're an idiot. That's dumb. Like, why are you saying this? But it's a starting point for you to start experimenting. Have that in mind, and then again, change up all the orders and try different combinations. And like Brian said, it's drastic. Changing Overdrive 1 into Distortion 2 and Distortion 2 into Overdrive 1 are completely different sounds when they're both turned on. A lot of the stuff, if people are using switchers and loopers, you might be thinking, I don't stack any of my overdrives, I only use one at a time. This is probably less relevant for you then. But if you use multiple drives at the same time, absolutely it's worth taking those drives off your board, putting them on the ground, and just spend 10 minutes going back and forth, changing all the orders, and it'll be 10 minutes well invested into your sound, into your tone. Yeah.
And if you have a loop switcher that has loop reordering, you could create presets, and you could just switch between the presets and hear the difference.
Yeah.
That's
and on a previous, was it maybe it might have been last week, we were talking about how loop reordering is kind of one of those things that live is probably something you won't typically use, but in this exact example, it's actually really handy. So maybe listen to that last episode as well to hear us talk more about that. But I totally agree. Loop reordering makes that, you can do it in 2 seconds. You can switch these back and forth and A/B them in real time.
Yeah.
I think that there's, again, validity in really doing it many different ways. My opinion on this is a little different, and
love it.
Usually I think of, well, firstly, there are going to be negative interactions between some overdrives just based on the impedance, how much gain that you set them to. Just because something is a higher gain pedal or it's capable of higher gain, but you're using it at a lower gain, that can affect the way that it interacts with other pedals. So you just have to consider, firstly, how you're actually setting the pedals in terms of the amount of gain and distortion.
Yeah.
My general rule is sort of the reverse of Brian, where I say use your highest gain pedals closer to the guitar and then get progressively lower gain. And the reason why I say that is any pedal that you're driving into a high gain pedal is distorting it more and giving you less definition the more that you're reaching sort of the ceiling of what the pedal is capable in terms of its clipping.
Yeah.
And so you are in essence, in most cases, creating more saturation and less definition the harder you're driving a high gain pedal. Now, there are some people that will say, well, if my high gain pedal is sort of representing my amp, then my pedals are hitting, hitting that stage like the same way that pedals would go in front of a dirty amp. And I think contextually it depends again on how you're using it and what your intent is in sort of, what the pedals are functioning as. Yeah. Usually what I like to do is I set my high gain pedals early in the chain, and then I'm using the pedals after it to add output. So it's increasing the volume, right? Because a pedal that's before an overdrive or distortion pedal that's running into it is not increasing the volume so much as it's increasing the saturation. A pedal that's after an overdrive or distortion, that's going to increase the volume as well. It's not just going to increase the saturation. Equally, like how a boost after an overdrive, it's going to increase the whole entire output. It's not going to change so much on the saturation level. Or it could be clipping the front of the amp harder, but it's not clipping your overdrive or distortion harder. So I usually stagger them in a general rule in that format. Highest gain closer to the guitar, and then I get progressively lower gain to the point where I go to clean boost at probably the very end of that.
Yeah.
There are some changes, though, to that, and there's some pedal sensitivities that just don't work well together. And so I do think that it's really an individual basis based on how you set your pedals and based on the particular combination, because there are going to be some that just interact better irrespective of what I just said, or any of us said in truth. The other caveat to this that I do get asked about on occasion is about pedals that are classified as preamps. I want to go on the record here as saying that this is sort of a newfangled terminology, that really anything that's in front of your amp is a preamp. And most of these are overdrives that have sort of been recategorized as what is being called a preamp, or maybe like a boost with some color or something like that. Most of these pedals that are called preamps could not function as an amplifier or drive a speaker cabinet or a power amp.
Just good marketing,
for the most. Well, I think it helps sell the idea that it's transparent, that it's acting, a very amp-like, but it is not the same as a synergy preamp model, or, where you could take a preamp section of a Soldano SLO and then drive that into a power amp. It's not that.
Yeah.
So there are some people that I think have used this terminology to categorize or classify their pedals, and I think it's created some confusion about where people put those. I think that generally if you're using the term preamp and you're kind of trying to make it resemble sort of an amplifier preamp, there's a case to be made that this would be kind of the last of your overdrive stage, because you're trying to get it to react sort of like an amplifier with pedals running into it. I think it's on a case-by-case basis, but I just wanted to throw that out there as sort of that I did notice in some of our signal path videos that came up as a question as to what do I do in this particular scenario. I would treat it like an overdrive, and I would kind of treat it like the last overdrive distortion pedal that's in your sequence. I would still put clean boosts and stuff like that after it.
Yeah, I will say, anytime I get someone asking about a preamp, and I ask them like, well, what do you mean by preamp? They're like, my first in pedal, always on, kind of like a shaper. And I'm like, okay, so you're using it more as a shaper than you are as a preamp. Like, oh yeah, I'm running a Jackson Prism or an exotic RC booster. Like, okay, then how is it set? Like, oh well, when I turn it on and off, you don't hear much of a difference in the volume level. It's more of just like the clarity of that input. Like, I'm running a Falcon or something, or I'm running a single coils. Like, I can click that on to tonally mix. Okay, so you're basically using it as a glorified EQ. So I get a lot of people that will ask, they'll say preamp, like preamp pedal, but really they're talking about like an EQ shaper.
I would also add to that just because you said EQ, I would put
Yeah.
any sort of graphic EQ after my last overdrive or distortion pedal in whatever order you put them in, because I think that that's the most valuable place to basically add a tone shaping aspect to all of your overdrive section.
Yeah.
That's usually the most valuable place if you're using some sort of graphic or parametric pedal based system, whether that's a GE7 or an Empress or whatever.
Have you guys ever? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, that was it. That was it. Go for it. Brian.
I was just gonna say, have you guys ever used the EQ2 by Source
I knew
Audio?
you were gonna say that. I was gonna ask the same thing.
Yes.
I'm curious about it because it has pre and post, and I have this one client who has 20, 30 guitars, and and it has like a gate on it, which I didn't know until you dive into all the menu stuff on it. But he uses we wired it. The input one was the very beginning because he could set that EQ for that guitar, and he has it on his PBC where he just scrolls through like the different types of guitar that it is. So, like he sends 4 different PC messages, and he's labeled which, like on a instant access scroll, he's labeled which one is which. But then he uses the EQ after the drives too. So I was curious about that with you guys.
The thing I love about that one is that it's MIDI controllable. So I think as far as if you're in a specific scenario like that, it's a great pedal. But I do have to say I don't have too much personal experience with it. I more know of that pedal from its technical specs online and less from I used it and I love it. But it's hard not to love stuff that Source Audio puts out. They seem to be a really great company. But
yeah, they're cool pedals. Another one that's in that same vein that you can have pre and post that has physical sliders is the Boss EQ 200. You have two EQs available in there where you can have a pre-post in presets and MIDI control and all that stuff. It is larger than the EQ2, so I think that's the downside. But some people do want to have physical faders that they're adjusting and not have, like the EQ2 is basically like you have like one knob that scrolls left to right in terms of the different bands, and then another knob that's like moving the fader up and down. But it's all done digitally. And so some people want to have that physical fader feel. But I would say that generally is where I like EQ. If we're talking about sort of like a serial pedal board, like into a front of an amp. Yeah. What do you guys think after? So we talked about, just to recap quickly for people, we have impedance sensitive. We have stuff. So fuzz, wahs, treble boosters. Then we have buffers. That could be in the form of a tuner, standalone buffer, a Goodwood audio interfacer. Then we go into compressors and dynamic pedals. So that could be pogs, that could octave pedals, that could be envelope filters. Then we went into and we talked about pre-post stuff too. Some modulation will have some dynamic stuff that you can put pre and post. Overdrive. Then we went to overdrive and distortion, boost, EQ, and now we're in the post overdrive and distortion zone. What do you guys think is next? Grant, tell us.
Well, I'll keep it quick. I know we're coming up on time here, but I think if you use a volume pedal, this is where I would put it. I have strong opinions on this one. I think if you're into volumes and swells, after the gain stage is great. A lot of guys will use a volume closer up to the front before any gain, which in my mind is very similar to being able to control volume on your guitar. And so you can clean up your overdrives, by pulling your guitar volume back. But if you put your volume pedal after your gain stage, you can clean up on your guitar and you can do some pretty awesome swells with the volume pedal. And the pro to that is having the volume after the gain stage is the whole way through the sweep, you're going to get the full sound clipping saturation of your overdrives from bottom to top, or from low volume all the way to high volume, which if you've experimented with is drastically different than doing a volume swell with the volume pedal placed before the gain stage. So that would be, if you're using a volume, I'd probably put it there. I would try both, just so you know, but I would probably suggest people to consider that spot.
Yeah, that's a pretty swell response, I will say.
Thanks, Brian. Thank you. Thanks, Dad.
Anytime someone asks me about volume pedals, I'm like, it's pretty swell. It's pretty swell. And they're like, oh, is it? And they're like, it just goes over there.
How many times a week? How many times a week do you think you use that one?
Oh my gosh.
Do you have a quota? Like on the boards, like, okay, I hit my 3. I did it.
I do a lot of dad jokes here.
I love it. I love it.
So I have probably like 10. I don't know. It just sweeps across the week. You never really know.
Nicely
I think you
done,
should get a
nicely done.
volume pedal tattoo, and that's kind of like open. You can say, "I'm swell."
I should. That'd be my first. I'll just get like right, or like right there. Yeah, I'm gonna say it's how I run mine. Is I run it after that, the volume, because for the exact same reason. I have a lot of people that ask about putting in the very beginning, and it's the same thing Grant just said. It's basically acting as if the volume on your guitar. So I was like, do you utilize the one on your guitar? I'm like, oh yeah, I utilize the one on my guitar and the one on the front of my chin. I'm like, okay, well you're basically just duplicating that. So, and I explained the swells, and some guys are like, oh, I don't do swells. Okay, that's fine. I'm just saying, like, I'm just giving you the reason why people put it in this spot. So my suggestion is always there. Sometimes it changes. I've had the occasional people that are like, yeah, I want it before my overdrives, which, you know, if you have noisy overdrives and you roll back your volume, you can cut out some of your noise while it's quiet. But yeah, my general rule that I typically tell people is volume is next, personally.
Yeah, I'm in agreement. Volume should be after overdrives, and distortions and EQs and boost and I think for the reason that you said, if you put a volume pedal first in your chain, it is duplicating the exact same thing that the volume pot on your guitar is doing. When you pull back the volume, it's not only attenuating the signal, but it's also cleaning up the signal. So if you've set your overdrives to respond with a certain amount of gain and distortion, and then you roll back your volume, now you're changing the amount of saturation that your distortion devices had and attenuating the volume. If you use the volume pedal after the distortion devices, it's acting as a master volume. So nothing changes about the fundamental sound that you've set up with your overdrive and distortion sounds. And all you're doing is basically the same thing as if you walked back to your amp and you started turning down the master volume on it.
Yep.
And so I think that this is valuable because you still have your guitar volume pot, presuming that you have a guitar volume pot, which there's very few guitars that don't have one. And so you can use that if you do want to kind of get the cleanup aspect. But you have that volume pedal as basically a master volume for the entire rig. You still have your modulation and delay and reverbs after that. So you still get all your trails. You still get that same benefit. But you're able to still get those burn sounds from your overdrive, and you're not going to do anything except just lower the volume. And I think that that's definitely the way to do it. Now, I will make one caveat to this, or one suggestion within this, is most people that I see using volume pedals after their drives, and they have observed some of our suggestions about using high-quality buffers and things like that, is a lot of people still use a 250K pot in that position, especially if they're using passive volume pedals. If you're using an active volume pedal, then this does not apply to you. But they still use a 250K pot. That would be great if you're using it right after the guitar. But if you're using it after a buffer, you should really be using the lowest impedance pot possible. So typically for volume pedals, that's 25K. So that would be what's called like an Ernie Ball active volume pedal. It's not actually powered. It's just called active because I think originally they intended it to be used with active pickups, but it's a 25K pickup. Or there's the Boss FV 500L. Low impedance is what the L stands for. That's also a 25K pot. And there's other versions of volume pedals, and I'm sure you guys might have some suggestions there. But you really would want to go with a lower impedance pot than 250K. 250K is only ideal if you're running it first because, again, that's replicating what most volume pots are that are built into guitars.
That's a good caveat.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, I know that we are at our time limit here as far as what we've committed to and blocked out. So maybe this needs to be a two-parter, and we will resume part 2 of this podcast next week, and we will start off on the volume pedal side. But just to do a quick recap, just so everybody is up to date, we have impedance sensitive, we have wahs, We have fuzzes, treble boosters coming early in the chain before the buffers, impedance sensitive. Then we have the buffer, the input buffer. This could be, again, standalone buffer, tuner with a buffer built in. If you used a buffer and you needed a tuner, I would just put the tuner right after it. Or if you have something like a Goodwood audio interfacer, you could, of course, use the tuner out and just be able to just get that tuner out of the way. You then go into your compressor and dynamic pedals. This could be pogs. This could be octaves. This could be envelope filters. We then went in, and you could also use a device like a Mobius or a synesthesia to use a pre-post. You could have some of these effects pre or post. We have overdrives and distortions, boosts and EQs coming next. This was kind of a toss-up, although we kind of settled on EQs coming after overdrive and distortion. Boost could become earlier in the chain, as Brian suggested. I think Grant and I kind of talked about boost after the overdrives. And then we went into the volume pedals, using that after all of your overdrives, distortions, and all that stuff. So we're going to end there today, but we're going to continue the conversation next week. Again, if you want to watch this, you can always come over to YouTube. That's the easiest way also for us to engage with you. If you have questions about this or sort of contingencies that maybe we didn't talk about that you want some advice on, we can definitely do that. And then also make sure that if you're watching this or you're listening to this, that you also make sure that you listen to the second part so you can sort of get the completion of this. Because right now, you only half of your pedal board is done based on...
if you use modulation and wet effects. If you don't use any of that, then your pedal board's finised. Congratulations.
Otherwise, we're just going to see a bunch of Instagram pedal boards that just end right at the volume pedal. And then
they didn't talk about it.
Yeah. So do make sure you do that. And the easiest way to support the podcast, if you really enjoy it, is go give us a review on iTunes. Just honest review is all we ask for. It doesn't need to be, a 5-star. Of course, we want a 5-star review if you can give us one. But if we didn't deserve it, then blame me, not Brian and Grant. And any final finishing words or thoughts from you, Grant and Brian?
I would actually, my only thought here is I would love, maybe even in the comments on YouTube, or, send us an email or something, but comments on YouTube so everyone can benefit. Tell us the experiments you've done, if any, after listening to this podcast, or ones you've done leading up to, because I love hearing the results of, I did the experiments, this is what I found, you guys were spot on, or I totally disagree, and this is why. Like, it's really great, I think, for everyone reading that stuff to see what the results are. So I would just say, I would encourage you guys to experiment and let us know what you found.
I'm going to say, come back next week, because I'm bringing more diagrams.
And you're going to get the swell tattoo.
And I am. I might ask my son to just draw with crayons or something on my arm. We'll see. Well, I'll get like a chest tat.
Yep.
Yeah. Beautiful. Well, guys, we will continue next week. Thank you. And
awesome.
For all you out there in TV land, in YouTube land, in podcast land, thanks for listening. And we'll see you next week.
See ya.
See ya.